Hi, I'm Nick Powell, City Hall Bureau Chief with City and State. Joining me today on City and State TV is Nicole Gelinas. She's a City and State columnist as well as a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor to the City Journal. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, Nick. Thanks for having me.
So, Nicole, I wanted to talk a little bit about the agreement between the Transport Workers Union Local 100 and the MTA that was brokered or announced yesterday. Can you take us through some of the finer points of that agreement? What was negotiated? Were there raises?
Sure. Well, the first thing to know is we don't know everything about this agreement. Although the contract has been expired for more than 2 years, it was brought together very suddenly. They haven't really released details like exactly how much they think it's going to hit the MTA budget, for example. But what we do know is that the 34,000 people who work for the union will get 8.25% raises when they're compounded over a 5-year period that started back in 2012. So it'll bring average wage income up a little bit above $75,000. There's a little bit of a healthcare concession that the union gave. They used to pay 1.5% of their straight wages for healthcare, and now they'll pay 2%. So works out to a few $100s in extra pay by each union member in return for a good $6,000 or so raise. So it's a pretty good deal for the union. And no real work rule changes or productivity changes. It'll take a little bit more for people to get to the top wage scale, but the net result is that this will have a big cost for the MTA. They haven't said how much, but clearly, as the MTA chief, Mr. Prendergast, said yesterday, it's not net zeros, which is what the union had been, the management had been asking for several years. The best that I can figure out from looking at the TWU's payroll, about $2.5 billion a year, this will probably cost about $200 million a year or so for the MTA.
So without these cost-saving measures, I mean, is this I understand the MTA said in December that any increase to labor costs could be dire for the agency. So what gives here? I mean, if there's no cost-saving measures, then is this an irresponsible contract to have brokered, given the state of their finances?
Yeah, it's interesting because as recently as 6 weeks ago, you had top MTA people, CFO and so forth, going to state hearings on the capital budget and saying, we need net zeros. If they had to spend more money on labor, it really puts the capital investment plan at risk. A little bit of background, they're just coming off a 5-year capital plan, a little bit less than $30 billion in investments in subways, buses, rail, signals, all of that good stuff. And they have to start a new capital plan, roughly the same size. And the short story is they've depended on borrowing for the past few capital plans, much more than is prudent. And that's because of state cutbacks, federal government probably cutting back in the next capital plan. It's very hard for them to borrow new money because they've got to repay the borrowed money, got to pay interest, and they're already looking at a $255 million deficit starting in 2.5 years' time. So any higher labor costs means that deficit is even bigger, making it even harder for them to borrow. So the capital plan was already a big question, how they're going to pay for this, and now it's an even bigger question.
Right. And now I understand that Governor Cuomo justified this deal by saying that the state's improved finances merited the raises and retroactive raises. So what gives here? Is he kind of painting a rosier picture than is actually reality? I mean, because there's been a lot of, I guess, debate on whether the state actually is running a surplus or how much the surplus is. What's going on there?
Yeah, he's certainly painting a rosy picture. The state economy as well as the city economy, both still very dependent on Wall Street, which is faltering right now. We're seeing the bank revenues come in. JP Morgan, Goldman, Citigroup all had big drops in their trading revenue. Is there a crisis? Not right now, certainly not. But the state, city, and MTA budgets all still dependent on this very Wall Street centered economy. And since they all still have long-term problems, failure to deal with healthcare costs, pension costs, rising debt costs, all of these big ticket items in the budgets. It's hard to say that this is a good deal for the taxpayers, and particularly for people who are concerned about the MTA's ability to keep investing in not only new projects like the 2nd Avenue subway, but even more importantly, just keeping the existing subway and bus system in a state of good repair. So, another thing the governor said yesterday was that this won't result in any fare hikes, but it's a little bit of a sleight of hand. I mean, the MTA has to pay its workers and pay for energy and all its other bills somehow. They get fares, tolls, and tax subsidies. So anything that leads to rising costs over time, they've got to pay for that. So fares have to go up or the tax subsidies have to go up. And already they've got 4% fare hike next year and then a 4% fare hike 2 years after that. And those things are, those are already kind of expected. And now we've got this wage hike, that those fare hikes, even with those fare hikes, looking at this $100 million deficit in 2.5 years, it's hard to see how the governor exactly can say that. I mean, fares are not going up today, but eventually people will have to pay for this.
Sure. Now, I understand the MTA is also negotiating with the Long Island Railroad employees. So what is this contract agreement with TWU? Does that affect this negotiation? Are they mutually exclusive, or can you see maybe some traction there with reaching a final agreement based on this one?
Yeah, I mean, the Long Island Railroad agreement is even more difficult because the work rules, the pay scale, and so forth are even more out of line at the much smaller commuter railroad than at the much bigger New York City transit, subway, and MTA bus system. But certainly, because this is a good deal for the union, you had management saying for 3 years, even longer, we're not going to do a deal that is not net zeros, that is no cost to management. And now they've abruptly made an about face and given out a deal that is clearly not net zero. So that has implications for the MTAs, other unions, but even more importantly for the city workforce, the people who work for the unions under Mayor de Blasio. You remember that Mayor Bloomberg had said over and over, no raises unless they're paid for with productivity, healthcare, givebacks, and so forth. Those contracts have been expired for 5 years in the case of the teachers, other unions several years as well, and it's hard. It makes it if you look at it from the mayor's perspective, it makes it easier for him to give retroactive raises now because the governor has gone ahead and done that with the MTA.
Right. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to ask you, with even if it was a small amount, the healthcare savings, that's been a part of the negotiations, as I understand. That's I guess kind of a way for the unions to come halfway and say, look, if we're going to get the raises, maybe we can pay a little bit more. Do you see that this deal kind of moving that forward with the municipal union negotiations?
It's hard to I think it makes it easier for the unions to say we're not going to work as hard on or creatively in providing these givebacks. First of all, it's already hard to give givebacks in the past. They can't be more productive in the past,
Right.
And this makes it a little bit easier for them to stay firm and say, look, the TWU was rewarded for waiting. They didn't have to take any year of zeros, which was very important for them, and it's likely that will continue to be a big point on the part of the city labor force as well.
Right.
So.
Well, Nicole Gelinas, the contributing editor for the City Journal, City and State columnist, and senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.